So that's how I ended up moving into a polyamorous home for the first time. We're polyamorous. There are 3 of us. These are our names. This is what the children call us. This is who we are. It's nice to meet you. We will all be coming to parent-teacher night. He is here to tell you about his Lord and Savior polyamory. And I am not.
My name is Abby.
And my name is Liam, and you are listening to the Evolving Love podcast.
In this podcast, we deep dive into the topics of non-monogamy and relationships, drawing from our experiences of being consensually non-monogamous for over a decade.
Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, curious, or anything in between, we invite you to join us for this conversation.
Let's begin.
Laura Boyle is an educator, podcast host of Ready for Polyamory, and author of the book Monogamy in This Economy. You may have seen this book recently featured in the New York Times article entitled 6 Books About Non-Monogamy, recommended by therapists.
Before we begin, a quick producer's note with some definitions. In this conversation, you will hear lots of words used in polyamorous discourse. And in case you are unfamiliar, we wanted to clue you in before you listen to our chat.
Triads. This refers to a relationship where each person has a romantic relationship with the other 2 partners. For example, if I were to be dating another woman and married to Abby, and Abby and my partner also were romantically involved, we would be in a triad.
Hinge partners. This is different to a triad because only one person has a relationship with the other 2. So if I were to date a man as well as Liam and my partner were not romantically involved, I would be the hinge in this V relationship.
In today's conversation, we discuss common polyamorous living arrangements, conflict resolution tools, blended families, the rental market for polyamorous people, parent-teacher interviews when polyamorous, de-escalating relationships, and so much more. And now we bring you Laura Boyle. Laura, thank you so much for joining us on the Evolving Love podcast today.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It's wonderful to meet you.
We're here today to talk about your new book, Monogamy, in This Economy. What we wanted to do was actually just to jump straight into this incredible topic, which you talk about so wonderfully within your book. And we want to jump into halfway through the book in chapter 5, where you have a chapter entitled Making It Your Own, the Polyamorous Home. And we wanted to know, in regards to your own personal experiences, what were the circumstances where you first found yourself moving into a polyamorous home?
I want to note for anyone who hasn't thought about picking up the book, my book, the subtitle is Finances, Child Rearing, and Other Practical Concerns of Polyamory. And that's the part where it is what it says on the tin sort of thing, right? The rest of the title is kind of the joke. And then that's the part names what it is, yeah? For the purposes of my book, I defined a polyamorous home as a home with 3 or more adults living in it who are somehow connected by an effective relationship, by either a romance or a sexual relationship, by some connection that is above and beyond what society considers friends or roommates, right? And this kind of household is not the household that most polyamorous adults live in. Most of us live as couples or as whether or not we consider ourselves solo poly, as adults who are fending for ourselves as solo people who then have roommates for the reason of the title, we are in this economy. And cost of living aside, those of us who do decide to live in 3 or more adult households in what I end up referring to as polyamorous homes, these non-traditional households, through the course of the book, do so for a variety of reasons. But most of the time, it's for the same reason that monogamous couples or polyamorous couples who move in as a duo do so, right? Because we have a strong affective bond and there's some logistical upside to it, and we'd like to live together. In my case, I had just had a child with one of my partners, and we were like, it'd be a lot easier to raise this child if we were living in the same place together. And at the time, I moved in with my then partner, Brian, and I think he was about 9 months old by the time we finished renovating the house that we moved into, and our son, who was at that point 9 months old, and his other partner, Megan. And the three of us all moved in together. And this was actually a pretty smooth move in, all things considered. The rest of my life over the previous year and a half had been much less smooth. I do not recommend the experience of being a first-year law student who falls pregnant unexpectedly, where one of your partners, who's the one who you're legally married to, does not want to parent, and you have to navigate the experience of what all of that means while deciding whether or not you're going to have that baby. Do not recommend that whole experience. I love my child. I love the life that I've had for the 10 years subsequently. But that actual experience, very challenging. So that's how I ended up moving into a polyamorous home for the first time. And so I had the benefit of Brian had just finished renovating this house that he was getting. His parents had built this house when he was a little kid, and they had moved into a different home, and they'd been renting out this house, and they were like, oh, you need a place to live. We'll rent it to you, but you should probably fix it up before you move into it. So take a few months and fix it up before you move in. But because he was in the process of doing that, we got to make some choices about what we wanted it to be like. Nothing so extreme as some of the people who I talked to in the book who did things like stopping ensuite bathrooms from being ensuite because they wanted them to be more fair, right? For living together in a multi-partner household, which I think is so smart, but I would never have thought of doing. But little choices that we made that made sense for us as a family with small children, or a small child at that point, and later 2 small children of close age, deciding that we needed to make sure that the bathrooms on both floors worked and that they both had decent tubs in them so that we could give the kids baths. We got to help make some of those choices, and we got to feel a certain sense of ownership in being part of the decorative choices of the house. So it wasn't, this is your house that I'm moving into. This was our house.
It feels very like you're custom building your home in the way that so many, non-monogamous and polyamorous people like to custom create their relationships. You're starting to think about creating a space that's really going to work for all of you. Laura, I'm really interested to know what your relationship and your friendship was like with your metamor at the time, and how, what were some of the conversations? What did they look like when it was discussing the sort of logistics and ins and outs of all living together in this polyamorous relationship, but also with a small baby?
Well, I think some parts of it worked really very well for us, right? We were really good at being in a V, and we were friendly, and we had a lot of values in common. And so it was very easy to figure out things that were logistical or that were how we wanted to live in the house were very easy, mostly. And then we occasionally ran into what throughout the book I refer to as roommate problems. Things of how were we brought up, who likes to do chores in what way, who doesn't like to do chores in what way. I don't want to get into too many specifics about it because I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. And I am not a perfect person. And we each had our big failings, right? And eventually some of those things just got to the point where they weren't super tenable. At the same time as we ran into what I think of as a pretty typical metamor problem of when we had struggles, they were major personality problems and everything was going to blow up and be set on fire. And when either of us had a problem with the hinge, oh, it's just a little fight and we'll be over it by the end of the week. And I know from having been a coach for many years that this is not just something that happened to us. This is a pretty typical pattern that people tend to be better at giving forgiveness and grace and space to their partners than to their metamors. There's a certain amount of cultural pressure to view your romantic relationships as a little more important and to give a little extra forgiveness and a little extra wiggle room to your romantic partners when the same behaviors come up from them than you do when they come up from people you're not romantically entangled with.
With the research that went into this book, you interviewed, I think it was around 500 people, to go into this, into the story of this book. What was the most common polyamorous living arrangement that you recognized in your research?
So as much as I and a million other sort of people on the internet have made the video that goes, we're not all thruples who nest every time there's a new TV show or reality thing that's look at this cute throuple that exist, right? The most common household structures absolutely are groups of 3 people. More than 60% of the people who live in homes of 3 or more adults are living in homes of 3 adults. In talking with folks, as I went through the follow-up interviews, right, I had just shy of 500 people answer the original survey. And then closer to 200 did the follow-up interviews with me, which is where we get all of the sort of rich anecdotes as opposed to just very simple sort of question answering about how many people live here, what rooms do they sleep in, things like that. From what we can tell from the follow-ups, it seems like about 2/3 of those are in triads rather than in Vs. That's partly because of that like partner effect, where you're more likely to feel like you're able to live with partners than with metas. But lots of people do a really great job living with their metas, and lots of people who are in those triads are in open triads, right? They're continuing to date outside of the household. They're interacting with their metas on a regular basis. This is not like a polyfidelitous triads are the most stable way to do polyamory message. I am not proselytizing any of that kind of messaging. That said, these structures tended to be more common, if only because it's easier to get 3 people to agree to things than 4, than 5.
I think back to all the times that we've lived in share houses at various points. And we have lived in a share house together, Abby and myself, when we were a couple, when we moved to New York at one stage. And it was fascinating to witness all of the kind of politics. And we had a really great experience. But of course, as soon as you introduce more voices, more personalities into the conversation, there are these really kind of intense emotions come up. And I wonder, Laura, in terms of your experience or maybe some of the anecdotes and the different people that you spoke to, do you find that the intensity really ratchets up to kind of this really intense level as soon as you involve romantic relationships under the one roof?
So in a lot of ways, polyamorous people are better prepared for that intensity. People expect greater intensity than actually manifests. One of the interesting things that I found in my study was that people were extremely prepared or almost hypervigilant for a higher level of like jealousy about things happening with their hinge partner and a meta who lived with them, for example. And that very rarely manifested into actual problems. But much more commonly, people had issues that they hadn't anticipated with one of their partners and metas who didn't live in the home, or newer partners who came up after they started nesting. Humans, by and large, according to many, many studies, this is not something I studied in this. This is something that I've just read about over the years in doing coaching and in sort of being a giant nerd, are very bad at anticipating or at like judging what their future emotions are going to be about a subject. And sometimes we misjudge in the direction of thinking that things will be much easier than they are. And sometimes we misjudge in the direction of thinking that they're going to be much worse than they are. And so this happened in both directions for people in my study around this subject. But there did tend to be trends in the direction of they thought that things were going to be much more intense and a little bit worse with people who they were intending to live with. They like over-prepared. And they underprepared for things with metas and other members of the polycule who they didn't live with.
Do you think that there is a sense of kind of being really protective over the community that you've built within the household? So the community almost acts as like this one organism eventually that feels really protective of, like some people might be kind of an added sense of protection, like if there's other partners or satellite partners coming in to the household, whether they don't live necessarily within the household. Is that something that you've witnessed?
I mean, I think for some people that's the case. I think for others, it's also that people don't. One of the conversations that I suggest that people have that came up as an issue for many people who I spoke to was talking about like use cases in terms of people visiting the home, in terms of how you want to entertain and things like this. because people would find that they had really mismatched expectations with their partners or metas who they were going to live with. And their feelings about that, whether that was resentment or difficulty or negativity of all different forms, would end up getting passed on to the people who were visiting more than to the member of their household who was doing the inviting and the entertaining. Again, as sort of an extension of that principle of us forgiving our partners more easily, they're forgiving their household members more easily than the people who are coming over. Kind of as you were saying, you're sort of protective of the people in your sphere. You become familial and protective of the people who are your family, your home, right? And so making sure that you get on the same page with them so that you don't hit a place where you're sort of starting to resent the other folks who they're innocently inviting over because they have a sense that, yeah, we can host and have people over sometimes means that you can have folks over for dinner 3 nights a week where you were thinking like, oh, twice a month.
Yes.
Right? Not that uncommon a mismatch as much as one would think that that's something you could clarify pretty easily. For some people, it's a really hard conversation to have because it feels like a conflict.
With dating other people, whilst living in this, in the group polyamorous home, were there situations where, if you were dating separate people, was it sort of a go-to where you would think, you'd go on a date out of the house or you'd try and see if they can host and things like that because there would be more sort of logistics and things to navigate in the home?
Well, people had a remarkable array of answers, right? And I spoke to people from all over, and so who had a really wide variety of circumstances, right? So there were people from rural and suburban areas who had much larger homes, and so gave me all kinds of answers that had to do with bigger guest rooms, with bedrooms for more people, with enough bedrooms that each person had each adult had their own bedroom. And so it was easier to be able to invite people to the home. You just sort of had to have boundary conversations at the outset about what kind of notice you had to give the other people who were coming over. There was also, by and large, a kind of generational difference where people who were more used to having had roommates, right? And this is mostly sort of my age. I'm in my mid-30s and younger, who have had roommates and had roommates for more of our youth, right? And maybe like me, lived with people for some period of time. But if we're in this like post-divorce, pre-second marriage era, maybe are thinking of having roommates again because we're living in this economy. People have a lot more of these skills of how do we live with other people and why and what do we need to talk about to do it, versus folks a little older than me and up tend to not want to have roommates, to feel like having to be accountable to anyone for their time is a major imposition. And I know this is like a very broad brush to paint people with, but it really did break down somewhere along these lines of like, roughly 35, 40 and up had much bigger, a much higher propensity to express that this had been an issue in their home, that folks had these like roommate problems, these problems of not wanting to treat each other as roommates who you made rules about house use with. So even if there was sufficient space, there might not be sufficient comfort or discussion of comfort or taking each other's wishes into account. And that would then cause issues for folks.
And how did you find, once those issues came up, I know you've spoken on your wonderful podcast, you have spoken with the Multiamory crew, and they have lots of kind of communication tools for dealing with these types of things. But in terms of like having a happy polyamorous home, did you find that there was like a common through line in the way that people would communicate and approach these discussions?
So yes and no. People had to find the tools that worked best for them. So while, yes, there's a common through line in that the most successful homes were the most willing to be flexible with their agreements, were the most willing to set agreements, check in on whether they were working, and then adjust as needed. The form that those check-ins took was really variable. And there were people who were very into things like Multiamory's radar tool. There were people who did a thing that like my household, when we all lived together, used to sit down and play periodic, quarterly, if not more often, games of Settlers of Catan over which we would air our grievances. And we chose that game because we all knew the rules well enough that they weren't a distraction, but it was enough of something to do that if anyone was uncomfortable, they could focus on the game. So instead of staring daggers at one another, you could stare daggers at the pieces on the board and like curse that someone wasn't giving you wheat or whatever it is, right? Like, oh my God, you took all my sheep. Instead of, oh my God, you never cleaned the bathroom, right? But you could come around to actually talking about the things that haven't worked since the last time we sat down and talked about these things. And if things were going really smoothly, we'd stretch this out to roughly quarterly. But when things weren't going smoothly, this would be a like every couple of weeks. Okay, we need to have one of these games after the kids get to bed because there are things to talk about. Put it in the calendar. Later this week, we're going to do this. And so you figure out what format works the best for you. I joke that I now have to trick my partner of 9 years into check-ins because if you give him a format, he won't do a check-in with you. But he's extremely willing to communicate and like share his point of view and listen to your concerns and problem solve. But if you call it a check-in and show up with like action points on a list or whatever,
right,
he will balk. It's very Gen X man of him. Again, I'm going to be horrible with the generational things, but they hold so true both in my practice and throughout the survey that I'm like, some of this might be real, you guys.
Yeah, we find that certainly when we have to have, trickier conversations, we'll often do it on a walk. Right. We find that's a really great one because you kind of your body's moving and you're able to process these type of conversations. I have heard some advice that people should lie down head to head on the floor. Like I've heard that being an interesting tool that's
I like
used.
sitting side by side on couches so that you're in a room that's personal, but it's not a bedroom. And then you're side by side so you can have physical contact of your arms and your leg, but it's, and you can turn away slightly if something's uncomfortable or towards slightly as you need the greater rapport, but you're not insisting on eye contact.
Oh, that's a great one. We'll put that one in the back pocket just for...
But yeah, the walking is really good for the same reason where like if something is something where you need the support, you can hold someone's hand as you walk or you can let go. The movement helps people process. Right? That's whenever I'm tricking Ken into a check-in, it's on a walk. But like we go on weekly walks, so it helps because we have regular conversations on walks too.
Yeah, you make the walk regular, but not the check-in. There's not that sort of stress around this looming like, everything's going to come to the surface.
But since we go on weekly walks anyway, every few weeks there's a thing and I go, oh, by the way, while we're walking.
I feel like at the moment that there seems to be a shift with people who I know, people who we know, who are even in monogamous relationships who are starting to rethink their family, living arrangements. I know some really close friends of ours, there were two couples and they were not polyamorous at all, but they were such good friends and they'd known each other for so long that once they started having children, they said, look, let's pool our resources. Let's try and, figure this out in a way to make this possible because it was so difficult to buy a home that they actually pitched in and they all bought a home together. And it felt quite radical as well for two monogamous people to do this. And it was a really interesting, beautiful experience because there were lockdowns happening and people were so sort of isolated, with who they could and couldn't be in contact with. And I remember, looking at their photos that they were sharing and they were having like concerts in their backyard because they're all musicians and the kids were all watching. And I was looking at that and I was just thinking, what a beautiful way, to go about this, even as a monogamous couple. And I just feel like, books like yours, Laura, can be so, so sort of normalizing and making these types of things, possible. And even though it's different, of course, you're coming through the polyamorous lens, but it does sort of lend itself then. I think so many people could also benefit from learning about these ways of being and cohabitating together in a group.
Well, right. I think the vast majority of the things that I talk about can also be applied to monogamous families or to blended families where you're talking about combining step parents into an existing family. The things that I talk about sort of easing transitions of partners into parental roles applies very well to step parents, right? And honestly, monogamous people are making up everything about step parenting as they go along, and so are we.
Yeah.
So it all works out. And like for what you're talking about with communal living, the book The Other Significant Others by Raina Cohen just came out this past year.
Yeah.
And all of these sort of ideas and structures are really sort of in the cultural understanding at this point in a way that they haven't been, in a way that I think is really valuable and really kind of beautiful. And I hope that it normalizes a lot more of this for us and that we move away from things like what I know is more of a problem in the States than anywhere else, but this idea of single family zoning, which is so restrictive for where people can live here. In the United States, zoning is decided town by town or county by county, depending on where you are. And zoning use determines not just whether or not you can put like commercial or residential property on a space, but also among residential property, what kind of house can be on it and whom can live in it. And single family housing is an idea that was determined to sort of keep hotels out of certain areas or keep boarding houses and things like this. It was sort of invented at the tail end of the Civil War out of certain places. And so in the like 1870s to 1910s, this became really widespread in the US. And it's partly a classist thing and partly a racist thing that it became so extremely widespread. But now, in the vast majority of the United States, everywhere functionally is single family zoned unless it's explicitly built in duplexes. And the single family, as it's defined, tends to be defined, it's a little different from town to town, but tends to be defined as living with only one unrelated adult in the household, which means only one adult who isn't married to or blood related to all of the other adults in the space. So that limits a lot of the households that I was talking to about where they can live, where they can rent from, where they can buy homes. And is part of why, in the US at least, so many of these households are held to 3 people, right? Because even if someone would like to move an additional partner in, if it's technically illegal to in a place where polyamory isn't a protected status, it becomes really a problem, especially if you have children. People are a lot more willing to sort of risk that if you're not also living with children in the house to violate those kinds of statutes. And like when I was in law school, there was a very interesting case of a family that had 11 people living in the home. A couple of them were children. It was a mansion around the corner from the law school I went to. They all pitched in and bought a mansion, right? 2 children, 9 adults. The 9 adults pitched in and bought this mansion. 2 of the adults had 2 children. And the neighbors basically got angry that there were so many cars in the driveway because it was a neighborhood of mansions, right? So it's all these stuffy people who were like, wait, why are there 7 cars in the driveway? This is a problem. And sued them for living outside of the zoning regulations. And they had to spend literal years fighting off this lawsuit and getting the town to change the definition of single family zoning to be defined based on the number of rooms in the residence instead of based on some family definition.
Yeah.
And it took them years and tens of thousands of dollars. And just, it was wild. And this was happening as I was having a child and moving into a polyamorous household.
Right.
And I was watching this unfold 35 minutes from where I was living and 3 minutes walk from where I was going to school.
Wow.
I mean, that is a really fascinating case. I mean, to play devil's advocate in terms of that particular case, it would have been quite a lot of cars in the driveway. And I wonder if there do exist laws to make sure that there aren't extreme uses of that scenario.
Sure,
you know
but
what I mean?
like it was a large property with a former carriage house on the property of a giant mansion. Like I walked over and looked at it. There was no one on, like there was one car that parked on the street. And 6 of the 7 cars fit in the driveway and converted to a garage carriage house.
I mean, it sounds like the perfect place to have a great cult, you know, as well.
Like, look, they were a giant polyamorous family, and they bought the house that was appropriate for them.
Totally.
And they were like, this is our home. And the neighbors were like, that's freaky and weird. And we're going to sue them because it was a very not in my backyard kind of thing.
Right.
And it took them several years to win this lawsuit. Right. And this was a decade ago now. And so it didn't get it got a little media attention, but not a ton because frankly, convincing the city of Hartford, Connecticut to change your zoning rule by a tiny bit by spending tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees is not nearly as like earth-shatteringly interesting as a bunch of the other kind of polyamorous advocacy that has happened because they didn't actually change their definition of a family. They just changed the zoning rules to have to do with how many rooms were in the building.
The distinction that they were a polyamorous family, I just thought they were a really frugal group of friends who were sitting around the table one night and thought, oh, let's all just go in and just buy this McMansion in the middle of a suburb.
Yeah, it was a polycule.
It was a polycule, yeah. I mean, incredible.
I mean, look, even if they'd just been friends, more power to them. It adds interest that they were a polycule.
If you're enjoying this episode of the Evolving Love podcast, we invite you to follow, comment, and subscribe. Sharing the podcast with friends, family, or lovers is the best way to support the Evolving Love podcast.
If you are interested in diving deeper and accessing my premium writing archive and other exclusive content, you can sign up at evolvingloveproject.substack.com.
It does make it really tricky in regards to when polyamorous people are going into the rental market, because I imagine it is the way that in this instance, they were able to buy the place and then maybe it was a surprise to everyone in the neighborhood, like one person might have been the face of the purchase. But of course, if you're a polyamorous family wanting to, and a polyamorous home wanting to enter the rental market, it would be extremely difficult to kind of hide those things out the gate. Is that something that you discussed with polyamorous folks?
So one of the questions that I asked was, did you have trouble renting when you were seeking to rent a place? Not that many people said that they did, but a lot of people considered it not to have been a problem that they hid how many people were actually going to be living there, or that they were already renting their place and then they had somebody move in and just quietly had them subleasing a single room from them or whatever the additional deal is. So I wonder if that number would be higher if more people had slightly more respect for the law, which I don't mind. As somebody who thinks some of these rules are stupid, I don't mind that much that lots of people don't have much respect for some of these rules. So, and lots of people's answers were like, well, I'm young and we live in a city, so people expect us to have too many roommates in here anyway. Right? And there was some subset of my respondents who answered that way. There also were plenty of people who were like, well, we intentionally moved into the home of the people who own a home so that we wouldn't have to answer any questions. My partner of 9 years has 2 of the 3 of them on the lease because putting the third person on the lease doesn't make any sense.
And Laura, did you find with the research and the answers that were coming in that as soon as living arrangements were sort of encompassing more than sort of 4 or 5 people, that there was sort of a pull to actually moving out of the suburbs and moving a little bit more, sort of maybe getting a property together, or just sort of being a little bit away from like judgment or or just, being with nature and just having a little bit more space. Did you find any sort of connection or correlation with that?
Well, so the two biggest households that I spoke to, which were each 7 people, actually were in the suburbs. They both happened to be in the suburbs of Boston. And it just so happens that they live in decent size houses in the Boston suburbs, which are extremely dense, but contain a fair number of, as you were jokingly saying, McMansions. And they're renting a couple of them, right? But at a certain point, some landlords don't care as long as you pay your rent on time, right? And the households that were one step smaller than that, which were still quite large, right, did contain more people who lived in sort of rural areas, right? I didn't get into a ton of detail because folks would have had to do the detailed follow-up interviews. And I had a few people answer emails for follow-up, but not get on the phone with me. So I couldn't follow up too deeply. So I got answers like, oh, we're in a rural area, this much distance outside of nearest city of any size, right? Which locates them in a particular state for me, but I don't know exactly where. So I don't know people's reasons for choosing their location. Some people expressed that they would rather be closer to centers where they could be near more people and be near more community than any sort of sense that they felt sort of secure in what their household was community-wise. And certainly a much larger proportion than sort of makes sense nationally were in actual city centers who answered my surveys. And I don't know if that's just because polyamorous people, like queer people, tend to gravitate towards cities.
It's kind of looking for community, and often with the more dense population, the likelihood of being able to at least find them more easily, especially these days with the internet.
And I find, polyamorous, non-monogamous people to be highly social people. They probably want to be close to where there are poly cocktails or their friends or, different gatherings and things like that because, they open to making new connections and friendships and polyamorous platonic friendships as well.
Right. And I don't have great ways to judge the ways that my data is biased, except that since I did online requests for people to fill out the survey and had it shared by several other people online, it's possible that we have some skew because of that.
The premise of your book is so wonderful because it does ask us to question the scripts that we've been given. We've been given as we grow up, we've been given even within the communities, like Abby and I don't necessarily view ourselves as polyamorous. We would consider ourselves, I guess, more in a fluid space that it's a little trickier to label. But in terms of the rewriting of scripts, when you did move into this polyamorous home, what did you find was the response from other people? Like, were you forthright in telling everyone that you were in this polyamorous household, or did you deliberately kind of only share that with people who needed to know?
I am generally a pretty open person. So I am pretty willing to do the work of coming out a million times. So I do we're out to every doctor, we're out to every school teacher. Yeah. I am not as out as some people. I have a friend who his children are very close friends with my children. We met at a meetup for polyamorous parents when our children were both babies. And so we both went to this meetup or we all went to this meetup, and they were another group of 3 parents with children in, what's it called? Like a car seat. And so, it was babies napping in car seats at the same time. And we were like, oh, same hat. And then we became good friends as a result. And so we've been good friends for about 10 years. And he is the kind of person who will walk into a bar and, without any prompting, start coming out to random people while we're out. He is here to tell you about his Lord and Savior polyamory. And I am not, right? I am not the Jehovah's Witness proselytizing to you. But if it comes up in any way, right, I will tell you a story about the thing I did with my boyfriend and the thing I did with my girlfriend. And then when you go, what? I will explain to you that the what is polyamory. And I will just kind of leave it there unless you ask follow-up questions, and then I'll explain a little. But I will very happily leave breadcrumbs because it's just my life.
And you don't want to feel any sense of shame by having to hide those facts. It's almost great that you can allow people to kind of join the dots.
Yeah. And that said, for several years when I first started being in non-monogamous relationships, I didn't connect those dots for everyone, or I did socially among my friends, but I hadn't come out to my family yet. And so I very deliberately didn't share those things with them. And then when I finally did come out, it was such a big deal to them that now I make sort of every attempt to be transparent, right?
Yeah.
Because it feels like now that I've done the thing, I may as well just keep doing that.
How did it go with talking to teachers about, being a polyamorous family? Because that is not something that we have navigated or thought about, but we feel like probably our son's teachers might know. We have.
Oh, they definitely know. They've seen us in the media, I'm sure.
We've been in the media and we've been in a few, articles and things like that. So I think, and it's juicy stuff, I couldn't imagine, it wouldn't surprise me if the teachers were saying, oh, did you know this child's parents, something or other. But
it's great gossip.
Yeah. So I'm really interested to know about your experience with that.
I feel like for us, it was most relevant because there were three of us who are parents to these kids, right? And that's the context that we brought it to the teachers in, was we did the very straightforward, we're polyamorous. There are three of us. These are our names. This is what the children call us, right? Because our kids have a mommy, a mama, and a daddy. And so this is who we are. It's nice to meet you. We will all be coming to parent-teacher night.
Yes.
We will all be at conferences. Sometimes we date and we'll have other partners. If you want, we can send you an email with their names and a picture of them in case the kids ever include them in drawings or whatever, so that you know who they are. This started when the kids were 3 and in preschool, right?
Yeah, wow.
So that's when we started doing this spiel. The teachers have not had any interest in knowing who is who, but they've also been if there's a person who is moving into the house or who is important enough that this child is spending daily time with them, I would love to know the names of those people.
Yeah.
Right? But this is from preschool teachers who also want to know who are the grandparents who this child spends a lot of time with, who are the adults who are relevant. By the time you get to kindergarten, teachers don't really want to know any of that except who are this child's grown-ups, right?
Yeah.
And that's the terminology that teachers use in our schools now. I don't know if that's what they do in Australia as well, but that's the gender-neutral way that teachers refer to a child's adult figures at this point.
Yes.
And so at the beginning of the year in elementary school, when the teachers are just let me know who the child's grown-ups are and who it is that I'll be calling in case of an emergency or in the case of there's a behavioral issue, we just make sure that all 3 of our names are on there and what our title is to the child is on there. We note on the school forms who are the biological parents, and then there's a space for step parents, and we list the other mom under stepmother for each of the children, because my daughter is my Meta's biological child. So we list each of us on the opposing form.
Okay.
So that the schools have each of our information for each of the other kid. And the school is just used to us at this point.
Wow.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think it hasn't come up for us in this way because we're not sort of navigating it in this same way. We're sort of it's us and then it's grandparents, and probably that's why it hasn't come up.
I mean, because we're not cohabiting. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it doesn't become visible unless there are more of you actively parenting. Right? Because like I said, my partner of 9 years cohabits and co-parents with his wife and his husband, his 2 partners who he lives with. They had a commitment ceremony about 5 years ago and now use the spousal terms, even though legally they're obviously not all married. And I don't need the U.S. government to come down upon them. No one is legally bigamous here. And so they at their kids' schools have a similar thing, right? Their kids are teenagers now. And still they're all the legal parents are on the forms as parents. And then the one who's not the legal parent is on there as the first emergency contact. The school knows all of them all of them go to parent-teacher conferences together. All 3 phone numbers are on every form.
It's so fantastic for you to be able to be so forthcoming to the teachers, and the teachers would actually really respect having that information. I feel like it would be trickier for a teacher to try and be doing the puzzle piece that we were talking about before, trying to connect the dots and going, oh, I don't want to offend the parents by assuming that maybe they're in a polyamorous relationship.
Because like I have friends who chose not to disclose these things and had like a preschool teacher pull them to the side and be like, look, I don't know what's going on, but your child was trying to tell me a story about dad's girlfriend today. Do you know what the hell is going on? Like about their like 2.5-year-old or 3-year-old in daycare, right? Prior to going to preschool, because they thought it wasn't relevant to like come out to carers before that.
Yeah.
And it's clearly relevant because little kids hear everything you say at home.
Right.
And will repeat it. Little kids will tell everyone your business. So I teach a class called Polyamory and Parenting. And like the number one thing I tell people is that you either need to be closeted to your kids or you need to be ready to come out to people. Because children will come out for you.
And what was the experience like for your children sort of when when they're at school and there are other monogamous families, and what was sort of the journey from the children's perspective from what you know?
Well, so my favorite story is that when he was in pre-K3, my son's class did like an all about families day. And he was in a relatively diverse preschool class in terms of what the family structures were like, just because at this point, like divorced parents are common, remarried parents are common. And so in his classroom, there happened to be obviously a majority like married monogamous parents, and then us, and then one family that had a single mother and one family that had remarried parents. So that child had sort of 4 parents, 2 sets of parents in different houses. And then another that had 2 parents at one house and 1 parent at another house. And he came home from school that day after the All About Families Day. And he looked at the 3 of us and he said, do you guys know that some people only have one mom? It's so sad. I feel so bad for them.
That's so sweet.
And just he was like 3 and just legitimately so sad for them. And we realized that we had too many queer and polyamorous friends at that point.
Well, he's coming from a place of abundance.
Yeah.
There's like an abundance of love.
Well, and he just thought that everybody was either lesbians or polyamorous because all of his friends' moms at that point were either pairs of moms or like groups.
Well, it's so important to normalize that for a child as well. So in terms of those initial conversations, were you just very explicit about the relationship structure that you had, or did you talk in code? Like, was there some way that you gently introduced these conversations?
I mean, I don't think we ever like explicitly, until the kids were a little bit older than that, because we talked with them about our relationship structure as Brian and I broke up. So Brian is now my ex. So I now co-parent with my ex and ex-meta. So when my son was 5 and my daughter was 3, we had to have a conversation with them because Brian and I had broken up. And this was confusing for them. Because we all love each other and we're all a family. We are all a family. We do love you very much. We are still going to be a family for you, and we're going to like run our lives around what you guys need. But Dad and Mommy are not together anymore. But Daddy and Mama are still together. Are Mommy and Mama still together? Mommy and Mama were not together in the first place. What? Like little explodey eyeballs out of the children as they realized that some people are not in love just by virtue of living together, because some things just don't occur to kids. If you care about each other and you cook each other dinner, you must be in love.
Yeah, for sure. They don't know all of the details about, intimacy and all of that. Everything's been sort of age appropriate. They know about family and love and being together, and they don't know about the ins and outs.
Right. And like we hug each other and we make each other dinner and we get each other birthday presents and we help the kids get stuff for each other for Mother's Day. So that's love, right?
Do you feel like all of your experience with, having lived together and, having these difficult conversations when it came time to sort of de-escalate the relationship and sort of find new pathways together with parenting, that, this was it, things were a little bit, a breakup is a breakup and it's very difficult, but do you feel like you had a lot of tools in your belt to sort of try and help navigate this, more smoothly perhaps than people who are sort of, maybe monogamous and getting divorced and splitting?
I don't ever want to make it sound like being polyamorous makes you inherently better at any stage of relating, or like being someone who helps people have hard conversations makes you personally better at having them when it's about yourself, right? Like I am just a person and sometimes I do stupid things. And I have difficult breakups and I spend a lot of time mourning them and I do not get over them easily. And de-escalating that relationship is probably one of the hardest things I've done in my life, right? And we did not always do a great job at the way we attempted to do it. But in the end, we made a lot of choices that were better for all of us in order to be the best resourced parents we could be for our kids. And now we do a really great job co-parenting for them. And so I think in the end, we've done a good job, even though at the time it was very difficult.
And it's a question of also doing what's right for everyone involved. These really difficult conversations happening, and in the greater scheme of the trajectory of things, I'm sure your kids will see that both my mums are happier and my dad is happier in that really difficult disentangling phase.
Well, right. And also, it's one of those things where maybe they won't fully understand because they were so young that they won't remember the parts that were difficult. And that's fine. They don't have to understand. They weren't the people in the relationship. Those of us who were understand that we've made the best choices about it and that now we're doing our best. And frankly, that's all that we can do.
When you entered back into the dating scene and you were meeting new partners, how would you explain, your previous relationship structure and your role as a parent? Is this something that you'd be, something you'd be super open about when you initially started dating?
I mean, polyamory is great for this in that I exited that relationship while still in a relationship, right? So when I say that I'm with my partner of 9 years, I've been with him since before my daughter was born, but after my son was born. So that helps. And he was with me during that extremely difficult de-escalation and supported me through it, which was great. Right. And then I've been with my girlfriend for about 2 years now. And she's wonderful. And she's been friends with me for several years before that. So she sort of knew a little bit about what my situation was before we got involved, and was pretty understanding. And generally, I think being a polyamorous parent in the first place, you end up having to do a little bit of a spiel of, this is the bandwidth I have around having kids and what their needs are and what my time of being sort of on kid duty is and how much I'm willing to allow partners to overlap that or to not overlap that in what ways. Figuring out whether or not someone who is new is okay with those strictures and with the boundaries that you're placing on yourself and on that relationship is honestly much more important than whether or not they're chill about how your previous relationship ended 5 years ago.
I'm just thinking, Liam, if we were to live in a polyamorous, household or, a group, what sort of comes to mind for you? What would a setup be?
The first thing that comes to mind actually is something that maybe you have some insight with, Laura. And that is, we talk about the way in which your menstrual cycle affects our relationship. And I wonder that if perhaps there was a V relationship and I was the hinge and there was another woman living with us, is whether your cycles would sync up and whether that would exacerbate any potential interesting issues that may arise. Laura, can you speak to this at all?
So no one reported that as being an issue serious enough that they wanted to bring it up. Okay. Even in the "do you have any other issues that you want to bring up?" question. So it may be a problem for some people, but they may have felt embarrassed to bring it up while I was being deeply nosy in follow-up interviews. I would have been happy to talk about it, but alas, more people wanted to talk about which chores they were going to fight over and whether or not mowing the lawn was going to cause divorces.
Yes.
See, when I hear this, I actually think that it would be better to sync up, because then you're on the journey together and you can have your, like, okay, this week I'm feeling this way, and then now we're in the spring and things are more upbeat.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so what comes up for you is that it's you and two women. That's what comes up.
Well, yeah. Well, it is fascinating because we talked to Kathy Labriola, Laura, who spoke so beautifully about you, and she said, "Oh, you've got to get Laura on the podcast," and so a special shout out to Kathy. But she has two husbands. And so that's a different dynamic. I imagine that some of the gender roles in which you talk about this in your book in terms of gender roles and the different ways that can impact. But I do think about, it would be a very different situation if we lived if my metamor was a man, and if that was the configuration.
Yeah. I mean, the partner who I talked about earlier, my partner of 9 years, lives, as I said, with his husband and his wife. And I feel like in many ways, that's a very balanced situation, because even when they're being difficult, it all works out in the end.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I've had a great time getting into
fascinating.
Chatting about all these things. We cannot recommend your book highly enough, Monogamy in This Economy, and also your wonderful podcast, Ready for Polyamory. But for our listeners who would like to check out more of your work, where is the best place for them to find it?
So my website, readyforpolyamory.com, has links to sort of everything that I have going on. I've got an events page where you can find the stops coming up on my book tour, classes that are coming up in the next couple of months. I'm teaching several online classes. And you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Ready for Polyamory. And then, of course, the book is available in bookshops everywhere. The links are available on my website as well as in my links in bio and all my social media.
And we'll be linking that in the podcast notes as well.
Thank you so much for joining us, Laura. It's been fantastic to chat with you today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Evolving Love podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback and support fuels our passion, and together we're building a community of curiosity, kindness, and growth.
Subscribe, comment, and let's keep the conversation going.